So that gave us information and very intensive information about EFSA. If there are any very specific for clarification for the presentation, any question very specific to this one? If there are, if not, we can keep it until the question session at 12 o'clock. So next presentation will be done by Patrick on the food regulation, on EU regulation on the food information to the consumer. So Patrick, please.
Thank you. With the organizers of this seminar, we thought that it would be useful to have a presentation in the opening session on food information to consumers, although it is not directly related to the subject of the seminar. And that's because, as you will see, there is very important legislation which has been adopted already by Council and Parliament in 2011 and will come into force at the end of next year in part, and at the end of 2016 in another part. This will have a very wide impact on everyone operating in Europe. And unfortunately, we haven't had an opportunity yet to present in Thailand this new legislation. I hope that with my presentation, I will raise the interest, and then we can one day organize a full session with the real experts on food safety, because this is a very complex legislation, as you will see. The labeling directive that we adopted in 1978 is widely regarded, in Europe at least, as the very first piece of consumer legislation that was adopted in the EU. For the very first time, a legislation was adopted in Europe with the consumer interest, the protection of consumers as the main object, the main purpose of legislation, long before we had even the program for consumer protection. It didn't include nutrition labeling. Nutrition labeling was the subject of another directive adopted in 1990, which is still in force. I will explain that. In 2000, the 78 directive was recast because it had been modified so many times that it was necessary to present it in a reformat it if you want. And that's the one which is still in force currently in the EU for general labeling. In 2006, we adopted the regulation on claims, nutrition and health claims. This was a new area. Until then, claims were not regulated in Europe. And nowadays, it is a very important subject. As Claudia said, there are many EFSA opinions on claims. It's one of their main output. There has an incredible number of court cases, including attempts to have the regulation cancelled by the Court of Justice. It is probably in the press, if you read EU Food Law, for instance, which is the journal that everybody reads in Europe, there's like 2/3 of every issue these days is dealing with the subject of health claims. I just read in the press this morning on internet that European Parliament is challenging a claim that has been adopted by the Commission on the basis of an EFSA opinion. Parliament says it's a ridiculous claim. It claims, it's alleged that it improves the operation of the brain. Interesting subject. Read the newspaper, the European newspaper today. And then the all-important regulation 1169 of 2011, and it's the one I will comment now, because That is, for the first time in 35 years, a complete overhaul of labeling legislation. In fact, it goes beyond labeling. It's called Food Information to Consumers. The nickname is FIC, F-I-C, Food Information to Consumers. It covers not just the physical labeling on the package, if you want, but all communication about the food on internet, on whatever media. Even it covers even social media. So to give you a graphic representation of what is the picture currently, I've divided in general labeling. This is sort of the classic labeling of what is mandatory, list of ingredients and this kind of issues. Then nutrition labeling, which is what the American and maybe also in Thailand is called the nutrition panel, which gives you the calories, the fats, carbohydrates and the like. And then finally, this specific subject of health and nutrition claim. So as I said, for general labeling, the legislation currently into force in Europe is still Directive 2013 EC. But from 13 of December 2014, the new regulation, Regulation 1169 of 2011, will come into force and will replace 2013. And it is a very much modernized legislation, as I will explain. On nutrition labeling, the current legislation is Directive 9496. Directive 9496 does not make nutrition labeling compulsory. It just regulates the way you have to make your nutrition labeling if you label voluntarily. So you are not obliged to put the nutrition panel, but if you do, you have to follow the format of the panel laid down in this legislation. In addition, if in your label you make a claim, a nutrition or health claim, then the nutrition labeling becomes compulsory, and of course you have to follow the format of the directive. So currently in the EU, nutrition labeling is not compulsory unless you make a claim. And if you use it voluntarily, as most producers do currently in Europe, the big producers, they label voluntarily. Or if you are obliged to label because you have made a claim, you have to follow the format in the directive. On 13 December 2014, Regulation 1169/2011 comes into force. It does not make nutrition labeling compulsory yet, but it changes the format. So if you label voluntarily, or you have made a claim and for you the nutrition labeling becomes compulsory, you have to follow the new format in regulation for voluntarily labeling or for labeling because you're compulsory because you have made a claim. And finally, on 13 December 2016, nutrition labeling will become compulsory in Europe for all pre-packed food. I will come back on all this. And finally, on health and nutrition claim, Regulation 1924 of 2006 is in force and will remain in force. It was not integrated into the food information regulation, the new regulation. Ideally, this is what we should have done. We should have incorporated it in the new regulation 1169 so that it would have covered everything with a common framework, common definitions and the like. But we didn't do that because we were afraid that if we tabled it in the proposal in Parliament, Parliament would change it because there are many members in Parliament who are not happy about the nutrition and health claim regulation. So it was better to leave it apart, even though it was not ideal from the legislative technique, if you want. So what will change in December 2014, as far as mandatory labeling and the number of items that you have to put on the label, it remains largely the same. You have to label the name of the food, which is not the trademark. It is the name, the designation of the food, either imposed by legislation or a name which will be understood by consumers. You, of course, have to put the list of ingredients. You have to put the quantitative ingredient description when it is necessary. We've not made the quantitative ingredient description for all ingredients like you do in Thailand. Thailand remains, in my view, the most advanced country in the world in that respect. No, it's true, it's true. I mean, credit where it is due. I've long argued with colleagues that we should at least do as well as Thailand, but we haven't done it yet. So that is probably in 35 years when we change it next. We have to put the net quantity of the food. We have to put, as usual, the date of minimum durability, or the so-called use-by date for microbiological sensitive product. There are technical changes, but no changes in principle. Storage condition and instruction of use where they are necessary, because otherwise you could not make a rational use of the product. Name and address of manufacturer. And we have changed dramatically the regulation about labeling the country of origin. In the former legislation, which is still in force in Europe, 2013, you only had to label the country of origin where there could be a doubt. For instance, if on a pizza you use an Italian flag, but the pizza is made in Germany, you have to label made in Germany, because otherwise the consumer would think that it was coming from Italy. So this is what we call corrective labeling. Labeling of the origin was not compulsory in general, but we have rules of how you can use it if you want to do voluntarily. If you want to say your pizza comes from Italy, what are the conditions in terms of the ingredient, in terms of where it has been made? So we currently in legislation really regulate how you can use the country of origin if you want to do that. And we have the corrective. If you suggest by the name or by the pictures, flag or whatever, that it comes from a country but it comes from another one, then you have to do the corrective labeling. You have a famous brand of clothes, Milano. Milano comes from where? From Spain. So if you want to use the Milano brand name, you have to say products produced in Spain, because otherwise everybody would believe it's made in Milano, which is the second biggest city in Italy. This is the corrective of origin. In the new regulation, we introduce a number of situations where labeling the country is compulsory, notably for meat products. And there are delegated powers to the Commission to make even more requirements for country of origin labeling when there is a single ingredient or when the main ingredient comes from a country and so on. So the regulation already introduced a number of situations where labeling the country becomes compulsory in the new regulation and provides for the possibility for the Commission to make it compulsory in a number of more cases. And the main result of the horse meat scandal in Europe, I'm sure you have heard about this, the horse meat scandal, was that Parliament said, you see that we need to label the country of origin, which, with all respect for Parliament, doesn't make much sense, because what you have to label is the origin of the meat, not the species origin. If it's beef, you call it beef. If it's horse, you call it horse. Whether it's beef from France or beef from Germany, it doesn't change much in that respect. So it is very strange. But it's because Parliament and consumer groups, I must say, are so keen on having more country of origin labeling that they say they took the opportunity of the horse meat scandal to call for more country of origin. And the Commission has announced proposal before the end of this year for this implementing legislation, delegated powers to the Commission to make more country of origin labeling. So watch the press, this is coming. And finally, more importantly, the regulation will make nutrition labeling compulsory through adding a new item in the list of mandatory labeling ingredient, which is called the nutrition declaration. This is a new item of mandatory labeling, which, as I said, will become operational, compulsory at the end of 2016. There are also very important changes in the modalities for labeling. As I already said, we now look at all media, that is food information. I keep saying labeling because this is the way we sort of discuss this concept, but it's much more than that. It covers the advertising of the products, any communication about the product, whether recognizable as advertising or not. So communication on social media can be caught by the new regulation. Also, everything in the presentation, the appearance of the product, everything which is placed in close proximity with the product in display will be regarded as food information to consumer. Basically, any communication coming from the producer about the product will be regulated by this new regulation. There are clauses on legibility, that it has to be very visible. Unfortunately, we have not gone all the way. For instance, there's still many packaging with a label like sort of red letters on a brown background. If you are getting old like me and need your spectacles and there's not much light, you cannot read these things. So there were calls for, say, labeling of the ingredients, of all the mandatory ingredients should always be black and white, not green on blue or yellow on orange or whatever. We have not gone all the way, but again, there's delegated power to the Commission to do surveys and eventually come up with proposal. Basically, this was discussed, but there wasn't time enough to come. There was not enough research done, consumer research done, to define this. Language is basically the old rule that the product has to be labeled in the language or in the languages of the country where it is placed on the market. And of course, the possibility to label in several languages. On the place of labeling, again, it's unfortunate because we had hoped in the Commission proposal there was provisions to have compulsory front of pack labeling of the energy value, for instance, in calories or kilojoules. But again, this was defeated in Parliament. So there are provisions that all the important information must be in the same area, in the same site of vision, but it can be on the back of the product. Again, delegated power to the Commission to introduce front of pack labeling in the future. However, there is a big change in the sense that now there is a requirement for the minimum size of the letters from the mandatory information. Producers very often claim, notably because they have to label in several languages in some countries, like my own country and the country of Kun Apichat and Kun Tritapon for the moment, Belgium. There are 3 official languages. Of course, it reduces the place which they can use for compulsory labeling. And the producers complain that there is not enough place. But then you see that they have pictures of ladies flying in the air and something like that. For that, there is always place. But for compulsory labeling, there is not enough. So, because some of the important information is in so small font size, we have now prescribed in an annex to the regulation rules about the minimum font size, which is more or less correspond to 8 points on your word processor. And as I said, there's a number of delegated powers to the Commission to regulate more in respect of the modalities for labeling. I'm explaining this very quickly because we don't have the time, but if you want to make a presentation on the new modalities, you probably need 3 hours because there are 7 annexes, each of them several pages about the new labeling modalities in the regulation. This afternoon, I have a short presentation, not even 10 minutes, about labeling of food additives. So you will see on just one item, labeling the food additives, that there are several articles, one entire annex dedicated to an issue like labeling the food additives. Then there is, of course, the nutrition declaration. This is, in a way, the most important change in the legislation. By the way, I was still head of labeling in the Commission when we started this work in 2001. We recruited 2 new colleagues. One is now the Director of Communication in EFSA, and Laure Gassin, to start a project. We decided on a day, okay, we will start thinking about making nutrition labeling compulsory in Europe. And finally, it was adopted by Council and Parliament in 2011. So you see already 10 years between starting working on this in the Commission and adoption, and it will come into force December 2016, let's say 2017. So it took 16 years from the time you start working on it in the Commission to it becoming compulsory in the Commission. So this is why I'm telling my colleagues, start working today on these important change that we will want to see, cloning and things like that. These are the themes of the future. So we better start early when you want to change something in legislation. As I explained, it will remain voluntary until December 2016, but it will also remain compulsory if a claim is made. And then you will have, of course, to label it according to the format, which, as I said, will change on the 13th of December 2014. There was a big discussion on this. You may know that in the US, they have 13 items of compulsory nutrition labeling. The panels have 13 items. And we thought of that. We made consumer surveys. And the outcome was that the more item you put, the less the consumer understands. And they give up after a certain time. There's too much information. You know the slogan, too much information kills the information. So the outcome of our survey is that you should concentrate on 5 items, which would have been energy value, total fat, saturated fat, carbohydrates, and salt, or sodium and salt. These were the 5 that our scientists or consumers experts or psychologists were recommending. In the Commission, we already added sugars. Normally, sugars would be included in carbohydrates, but we had to label, in the Commission proposal, influence of the lobby of people with diabetes who wanted the sugar to be labeled separately. And Parliament has even added one protein, which in my view doesn't really fit there. Because if you look at the list, and especially the 5, energy, total fat, saturated fats, carbohydrate, and salt, these are the nutrients which you want to avoid when you select the food in a healthy diet, at least. Protein is an interesting future. So you can leave it in the part of the labeling, the nutrition labeling, that producers can always add on a voluntary basis. Because, of course, the 5 compulsory one, which must be in one block, can always be supplemented by other items that the producer wants to label. Protein, fibers, vitamins, and the like, they can add that. But those which you have to force them to label are the calories, the sugar, carbohydrates, the fat, and the saturated fats. There were long discussions about trans fats, should we make trans fats compulsory or not? The Americans do. In the end, all nutritionists say it's dangerous to label trans fats because people will concentrate on that. And they will look for products with zero or little trans fats, but they may choose products with a lot of saturated fats instead. And saturated fats are just as bad as trans fats. Actually, trans fat in this labeling is part of saturated fats. So you should worry about saturated fats, all saturated fats, and not just trans fat. But again, there is an article which says the Commission will reflect on the opportunity, the desirability of introducing compulsory labeling of trans fat, and if the outcome is positive, then the Commission has the power to do that by delegated powers. There was discussion as to whether we should keep the labeling per 100 milligram or 100 milliliters. You may know that in the US, they prefer to label by portion. Let's say a portion is 30 milligram for biscuits, then you say the energy and the fats and so on in one portion of biscuit. The problem is that in the EU, 28 countries, very different diets still today. I mean, no, it's not in the EU, but Finland or Denmark, the diet is very different than, say, Portugal and Greece. So there isn't something like a European typical portion size. So we keep the compulsory label per 100 milligram, 100 milliliter, and you can always add the fats or the calories per portion if you want to do that. Another reason for keeping this system, which is the current system in Europe, is that Europeans do use the nutrition labeling differently than the Americans, or the North Americans, let's say. Because in North America, you count your calories when you sort of your maximum 2,000 or 2,500 or whatever calories per day, and you count not to exceed that. Europeans use the nutrition information more to compare between two products. They take two products on the shelf, which one shall I buy? The one which has the least calories, and this is why calories per 100 gram is a better system if you want to sort of compare products between themselves rather than count your calories. Again, there is delegated power to the Commission to regulate, notably on the portion, what is a portion, and maybe even introduce a regulation on portion size for typical products in an average diet. So as you see, there's a lot of these possibilities for regulate more and better, hopefully, when we have better intelligence on what the consumer wants. And as I said, unfortunately, the Commission proposal to compulsory label the nutrition information on the front of the pack, the one which you see in the shops, has not been adopted by Parliament. We had hoped that at least the energy in calories or in kilojoules would be on the front of the pack, because this is what interests most consumers these days. But we were not successful. Parliament didn't want that. Probably the influence of the industry, you have to be realistic, and it didn't get in. There was also proposal to introduce traffic light. I know it's a concept familiar in Thailand because there was also once a notification to WTO by Thai FDA, if I remember correctly, for the traffic light labeling of snacks, if I remember correctly. That was in 2004. It was never followed up. The regulation was not adopted, not